The galaxy was vast, filled with countless stars, planets, and civilizations, each with its own unique culture and history. Among all these civilizations, some were peaceful and others were more ambitious, often vying for resources or territorial control. But there existed a name that echoed through the void of space with fear and awe: the Death. Their reputation was not just known among one or two star systems. It spanned across multiple galaxies. They were considered one of the most dangerous and formidable species ever encountered. Unlike other civilizations that focused on trade, diplomacy, or exploration, the Deathworlders were defined by one thing: survival through dominance. From the moment a young Deathworlder was born, they were trained to endure, fight, and conquer. Their culture emphasized strength, strategy, and the ability to eliminate threats before they could even materialize. Stories about their early history were often grim. Legends told of planets that had once been thriving, only to vanish from records after the Deathworlders arrived. Entire populations had disappeared, and yet there were no negotiations, no treaties, only swift and total eradication. The Deathworlders' ships were as legendary as the species itself, towering warships, covered in armor that could withstand even the most powerful energy weapons, patrolled space with almost a predatory precision. Unlike other fleets, which often consisted of a mix of cargo, transport, and combat vessels, the Deathworlder fleet was designed entirely for one purpose: combat. Every ship was a weapon, every weapon meticulously engineered to maximize destruction. Their commanders were brilliant tacticians trained to calculate outcomes with almost mathematical precision. This combination of unyielding training, technological superiority, and ruthless efficiency made them feared across star systems. Even stories passed down by civilizations that had never seen them firsthand carried a chilling tone, warning that to summon or encounter the Deathworlders was to invite inevitable peril. Despite their fearsome reputation, the Deathworlders were not mindless killers. They were intelligent, methodical, and highly disciplined. Each operation was carefully planned. Each target was analyzed before action was taken. For them, hesitation or compassion was a weakness that could endanger their entire species. To other civilizations, they seemed merciless. But to the Deathworlders themselves, it was simply logic. Survival demanded total elimination of threats. In this way, they were less an enemy and more a force of nature. When a civilization received a signal or SOS from an unknown species, the Deathworlders would evaluate it with cold detachment. If there was any possibility that responding could result in danger or compromise, the Deathworlders acted with preemptive force. In the far reaches of the galaxy, there existed an alien civilization known for its curiosity, intelligence, and peaceful nature. Unlike the Deathworlders, they believed in diplomacy, mutual aid, and exploration. Their technology was advanced, capable of interstellar communication and travel, yet they lacked the combat prowess that some species, like the Deathworlders, took for granted. When they encountered a situation beyond their understanding, a sudden threat from a more aggressive species, they sent out a desperate SOS hoping for help from any ally that might be listening. They broadcasted their plea across light years, fully expecting assistance from friendly neighbors or intergalactic forces that shared their ideals. Their message was simple: we are in danger. Please help us. They did not realize that the signal would reach ears that interpreted distress very differently. The Deathworlders, traveling through the void on one of their routine patrols, detected the SOS for the aliens. The response seemed promising. The thought of a fleet arriving to save them brought hope, relief, and a sense of safety they had never felt before. But the Deathworlders did not respond out of empathy or a desire to aid. They analyzed the transmission, assessed the species' capabilities, and concluded that this civilization, while intelligent and advanced, could pose a future threat if left unchecked. To the Deathworlders, any species that could send interstellar signals and navigate the stars was potentially dangerous. Therefore, their doctrine dictated that any unknown civilization that drew attention to itself must be neutralized to ensure the safety of all Deathworlder operations and populations. The contrast between the aliens' expectations and the Deathworlders' reality could not have been more stark. As the aliens prepared their cities and fleets to welcome what they believed was a savior, the Deathworlders prepared in their own way, readying every weapon, strategy, and tactical maneuver for total domination. There was no misunderstanding on the Deathworlder side. The SOS was a signal that required action, and action for them meant complete eradication. For the aliens, it was a moment of optimism, of relief that help was finally arriving. They could not have imagined the kind of beings that were about to enter their space, beings for whom compassion was irrelevant and annihilation was routine. The Deathworlders' arrival was, in itself, a spectacle of power. Even before they reached the alien system, their presence could be detected from orbiting satellites and planetary observation posts. The size of the fleet alone was overwhelming, with massive warships that blotted out the light of nearby stars. Their formation was precise, moving as if guided by a single mind. For the aliens watching from their homeworlds and orbital stations, it was awe-inspiring and terrifying in equal measure. They believed this to be a show of solidarity, a demonstration of the fleet's commitment to protecting them. They did not realize that each ship carried weapons capable of destroying entire continents and that every member of the fleet operated under orders to leave no survivors if a threat was detected. The alien leaders held meetings, issuing instructions for defense, evacuation, and coordination with what they assumed were allied forces. Scientists and engineers worked frantically to ready defensive grids and communication networks, hoping to optimize the fleet's assistance. Citizens watched the skies with mixed emotions, some hopeful, others anxious. There was a shared sense of optimism, a belief that help had arrived just in time. Every decision they made was based on the assumption that the fleet's intent was aligned with theirs, that they were being saved from imminent danger. What they could not see, what they could not understand, was that the Deathworlders had their own perspective, one shaped by millennia of survival, warfare, and strategy. To them, the aliens' planet represented both a risk and an opportunity, a chance to demonstrate dominance, eliminate an unknown species that could one day challenge them, and reinforce their reputation across the galaxy. There was no moral dilemma or hesitation. The philosophy of the Deathworlders was clear and unyielding. Preemptive neutralization of potential threats was not just acceptable, it was essential. Thus, the stage was set for a momentous clash, even if the aliens themselves were unaware of it. The SOS had traveled across the void with hope and fear embedded within it. In one corner, a civilization clung to life, expecting salvation. In the other, a fleet of unstoppable warriors approached, interpreting the signal not as a plea for aid but as a green light for eradication. The tension was palpable, though invisible. In this vast expanse of space, where civilizations rarely interacted, a single signal had triggered the collision of two completely different worldviews, one of hope, one of calculated destruction. As the alien civilization continued to prepare for what they believed would be assistance, small signs of unease began to emerge. Some analysts within their ranks noted the unusual formation of the approaching fleet, the sheer scale of their weapons, and the speed at which they were closing in. Yet these warnings were not fully comprehended, often dismissed as errors or mistakes. The aliens were still caught in the mindset of gratitude and relief, unable to reconcile the possibility that the beings responding to their SOS might not share their moral framework. In parallel, aboard the Deathworlder ships, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. Commanders reviewed tactical data, discussing planetary defenses and possible escape attempts by the aliens. Engineers calibrated weapons, while soldiers prepared boarding protocols and combat strategies. Every detail was considered, every variable analyzed. Unlike other fleets that might hesitate or negotiate, the Deathworlders operated with singular focus. The SOS had triggered their systems and the response was predetermined by doctrine: neutralize, dominate, and exit. There was no room for deviation. By the time the Deathworlders entered the alien system, the stage was fully set for what was about to unfold. The galaxy held its breath, though few knew of the impending disaster. To the aliens, this moment symbolized hope realized. To the Deathworlders, it was merely the execution of duty. The history of the galaxy had brought them to this intersection of events: a peaceful civilization reaching out for help, and a fearsome species interpreting that help as a threat. The consequences of this meeting would ripple across light years, shaping legends, cautionary tales, and the understanding of survival in a universe where intentions could be so radically misunderstood. Even before the first contact, the narrative was clear: the Deathworlders did not seek allies, they sought dominance. For the aliens, this truth remained hidden until it was too late. The SOS had been sent with the purest of intentions, but the universe had a way of twisting hope into catastrophe when the wrong eyes received it. What began as a plea for help had unknowingly called forth a force that would redefine the meaning of fear in their world. The galaxy, vast and indifferent, would watch as history unfolded, and the Deathworlders continued their relentless path through the stars. As the SOS from the alien civilization spread across the vast reaches of space, ripples of tension began to form within their world. Initially, the message was seen as a desperate cry, one that demanded immediate attention. In the high towers of their capital cities, alien leaders huddled together, eyes fixed on holographic displays showing their homeworld and the distant reaches of the galaxy. Each display flickered with the progress of their call for help. The waves of light-speed communication signals racing across systems, seeking aid from anyone willing to respond. The urgency of the situation was undeniable. Something had happened in their system, an unknown threat, a sudden invasion, or perhaps a catastrophic disaster. They did not fully understand the magnitude of what they were facing, but they knew it was beyond their ability to handle alone. Within the alien society, a mixture of hope and fear took root. Scientists, military officers, and political leaders all debated the nature of the threat. Some suggested that it was merely a minor crisis, something that could be managed with careful coordination and the mobilization of their defense forces. Others, however, feared that the problem was far graver than anyone could imagine. They spoke quietly of the unknown entities lurking in deep space, the civilizations whose motives were unclear, and the possibility that their world could be destroyed before anyone arrived to help. Despite these fears, there was a cautious optimism. After all, they had sent out their SOS in the hope that some powerful force would arrive to protect them, to aid them in a time of dire need. At the same time, far from the alien homeworld, the Deathworlder fleet was already in motion. Across the void of space, massive ships navigated with a precision that was almost unnatural. These vessels were not just instruments of war, they were living symbols of the Deathworlder's philosophy: strength, efficiency, and total dominance. Every captain, every crew member, had been trained for decades, even centuries, in the art of combat and the doctrine of preemptive neutralization. When the SOS was detected, it was not a call for assistance that reached their senses, it was a potential risk. Any civilization capable of sending signals across light years had the capacity for power, knowledge, and influence. To the Deathworlders, such a civilization could not be ignored. They had to act, and they had to act decisively. The contrast between the two perspectives could not have been greater. On one side, the aliens were full of hope, preparing for rescue, imagining fleets of allies descending from the stars to aid them. On the other, the Deathworlders approached with cold calculation, interpreting the signal as both a challenge and an opportunity. Their philosophy left no room for error or negotiation. To hesitate, to show mercy, was to invite danger. And so, the Deathworlders readied themselves for the operation, meticulously planning each move, analyzing every possible scenario, and ensuring that no variable was left. Back on the alien homeworld, preparations intensified. Cities buzzed with activity as defensive grids were reinforced, communications systems enhanced, and emergency protocols rehearsed. Scientists scrambled to develop contingency plans, estimating the capabilities of the potential rescuers, imagining the types of support that could arrive, and coordinating with local forces to make the most of any aid that came. Meanwhile, civilians were instructed to remain calm, though fear was evident in every corner. Families huddled together, watching the skies and wondering if this mysterious fleet would arrive in time to save them. Children asked questions that adults could not fully answer, and elders spoke of ancient legends, hoping that some protective force from the stars would intervene. Despite these efforts, there were uncertainties that no amount of preparation could eliminate. The aliens had never encountered the Deathworlders before, nor had they understood the full scope of what a truly unstoppable force could do. Their intelligence systems had never recorded such a species, and their historical archives contained only rumors and fragmented stories of civilizations destroyed in ways that defied comprehension. For the aliens, this was a problem that seemed both distant and immediate at the same time. They could see the SOS traveling across space, but they could not see the reaction it would provoke, and that ignorance would soon prove to be a fatal vulnerability. Within the Deathworlder fleet, decisions were being made at a staggering speed. Commanders analyzed data transmitted from their scouts, looking for signs of defensive strength, population centers, and technological advancement. They evaluated the alien civilization's capacity for resistance, mapping out every major city, fleet, and defense system. Unlike the aliens, who focused on hope and optimism, the Deathworlders focused on calculations, probabilities, and tactical outcomes. Each ship was equipped with long-range sensors, capable of detecting minute energy signatures, technological anomalies, and even attempts at stealth. Every member of the crew understood the stakes. Failure was not an option, and in the Deathworlder mindset, failure was unacceptable not because of pride, but because of survival. As the Deathworlders approached, their fleet became increasingly visible to the aliens. Massive vessels, shaped like predators and covered in impenetrable armor, moved through space with deliberate purpose. The alien observation posts detected them and transmitted frantic updates to their leaders. The sight of such ships inspired awe and hope among many, reinforcing the belief that help had arrived. Yet even as they watched the fleet, some scientists and analysts felt a subtle unease. The formation was unlike any known allied fleet. The precision, the symmetry, the sheer size of the vessels suggested a species entirely devoted to combat. But these warnings were faint whispers in a chorus of optimism, easily drowned out by the hope that the fleet was coming to save them. Inside the Alien Leadership Council's debates erupted. Some advocated for immediate evacuation, suggesting that citizens be moved to underground bunkers or evacuation pods. Others believed that such measures would panic the population unnecessarily and that it was best to wait for the fleet to arrive. Communication networks buzzed with activity as emergency broadcasts were prepared and defensive protocols were rehearsed. Yet, despite all these preparations, there was a lack of understanding about the true nature of the approaching fleet. The aliens were preparing for assistance, unaware that what approached them was not aid, but a force trained to eliminate potential threats with absolute efficiency. With the tension among the aliens grew as the fleet drew closer. Scientists worked tirelessly to calculate escape trajectories, defensive patterns, and countermeasures. Military officers trained troops in anticipation of possible engagements, running drills and simulations. Families stocked supplies and sought shelter, hoping that the preparations would be enough to survive. Even as the aliens coordinated their response, they could not shake the sense of unease that began to creep into the collective consciousness. Something about the fleet's approach felt different, almost unnatural, but no one could articulate exactly what it was. Meanwhile, the Deathworlders continued their meticulous preparation. Each ship received final calibrations, weapon systems tested and recalibrated, and shields optimized for maximum efficiency. Tactical officers ran simulations of potential resistance scenarios, predicting every possible defensive maneuver the aliens might employ. Engineers and scientists worked to ensure that every system functioned at peak performance, knowing that even a minor error could jeopardize the mission. In the Deathworlder mindset, there was no room for hesitation, no room for mercy, and no room for failure. As the alien system came into clearer view, the rising challenge became even more pronounced. Their sensors detected the sheer scale of the fleet, the number of warships, and the power contained within each vessel. Panic began to spread among some factions, though leaders attempted to maintain order. Efforts to communicate with the fleet were met with silence, adding to the growing uncertainty. The aliens did not realize that the fleet was not listening for requests, nor would it respond to negotiations. Every action taken by the Deathworlders was calculated and predetermined, and the SOS had already triggered a response that was inevitable. A dangerous mixture that created an almost unbearable suspense within the alien civilization. Every moment seemed to stretch infinitely, as citizens watched the skies and waited for the fleet to arrive. Scientists ran endless calculations, predicting what kind of assistance might come, while military strategists prepared for battles they assumed would be defensive in nature. Yet the reality was far more terrifying than anything they had imagined. That aliens could not anticipate the true intent of the fleet approaching their system. The stage for the upcoming confrontation was set in subtle, almost invisible ways. Every decision the aliens made, every preparation, and every hope placed in the fleet's arrival contributed to the tension and uncertainty of the moment. They were preparing for a savior, while the Deathworlders were preparing for a mission that had nothing to do with salvation. This rising challenge of misaligned intentions, of hope and fear colliding with ruthless efficiency defined the moment. It was a phase of preparation, anticipation, and growing anxiety that set the scene for the dramatic events that would soon unfold. The aliens' rising challenge was not only external but internal. Leaders struggled with decisions, scientists wrestled with incomplete data, and citizens lived with the constant uncertainty of what would come. Every attempt to predict the future was shadowed by the knowledge that their calculations might be entirely wrong. And as the Deathworlders drew closer, the aliens could sense, even if they did not understand, that their fate hung in a delicate balance. The challenge was not simply to survive an attack, but to comprehend the magnitude of what was coming and to prepare for a reality that was beyond their understanding. The rising challenge phase captured the tension of two civilizations approaching a collision of unimaginable consequences. The aliens, full of hope and fear, prepared for rescue that would never come as expected. The Deathworlders, efficient and relentless, advanced with a clarity of purpose that left no room for negotiation. The SOS that had been sent in desperation had triggered events that neither side fully understood. It was a moment of anticipation, a build-up of tension, and a prelude to the catastrophic events that would follow. The aliens' world had entered the phase of rising challenge, where preparation met uncertainty, and hope met inevitable danger. Every decision, every calculation, and every action contributed to the mounting suspense, setting the stage for the dramatic unfolding of history that would soon reach its apex. The moment that would change everything for the alien civilization arrived without warning, though the signs had been quietly building in the hours and days leading up to it. From the surface of their planets to the orbital stations above, every sensor, every telescope, every communication relay began to pick up the unmistakable presence of the Deathworlder fleet. At first, many assumed that what they were seeing was part of the relief they had so desperately hoped for, a massive fleet. True, but surely composed of allies who had come to their aid. The sheer scale of the approaching vessels filled the sky with awe-inspiring magnificence. They were enormous, their hulls glinting faintly under the light of distant stars, and their formation was perfectly symmetrical, moving in a synchronized rhythm that suggested an intelligence both powerful and precise. For the aliens, it was a moment of disbelief mingled with hope. Could this be the rescue they had dreamed of? But hope is often fragile, and the universe has a way of twisting expectation into tragedy. As the fleet drew closer, subtle anomalies began to appear. Sensors that had been calibrated to detect energy outputs and defensive mechanisms suddenly registered levels far beyond anything the aliens had anticipated. The formation of the fleet was not random, as they initially believed, nor was it designed for ceremonial display. It moved with a purpose that was impossible to misinterpret. Once one understood its nature, these ships were designed for offense, for overwhelming power, and for the total neutralization of any potential resistance. Yet the alien leaders, desperate for salvation, struggled to interpret the signals correctly. Their hopes overpowered their analytical reasoning, causing them to cling to the comforting illusion that this arrival represented help, not annihilation. Meanwhile, aboard the Deathworlder command vessels, Calculations and analyses proceeded at a staggering pace. Every ship was aligned with tactical objectives, every weapon calibrated for maximum efficiency, every crew member ready for immediate action. The fleet had received the SOS, and in the Deathworlder's understanding, the only rational response to an unknown civilization capable of broadcasting across interstellar distances was to eliminate the potential threat before it could manifest. There was no hesitation, no moral debate, and no consideration for the alien civilization's intentions. To the Deathworlders, survival was paramount, and the rules of engagement were simple: neutralize all threats, preemptively and completely. The turning point, then, was not merely the arrival of the fleet. It was the moment when intention collided with reality, when the aliens' hope met the Deathworlders' doctrine of preemptive destruction. On the alien homeworld, preparations continued, but cracks in the illusion of safety began to appear. Engineers noted strange fluctuations in the fleet's energy fields. Military officers detected movement patterns that did not correspond with Allied protocols. Panic started to ripple through the ranks of those who were more perceptive, though their warnings were often drowned out by the chorus of optimism that had gripped the civilization. Children, sensing the tension among the adults, began asking questions that no one could confidently answer. Civilians watched from their homes and observation decks, torn between the joy of anticipated rescue and an unshakable feeling of unease. There was a tension in the air that was palpable, as if the atmosphere itself were holding its breath for the inevitable moment of revelation. Then, the first signs of the turning point became undeniable. A series of energy readings from distant orbitals and remote observation stations indicated that the fleet's weapons systems were activating. These were not simple warning beacons or communication pulses. They were calibrated, powerful signals that suggested an imminent use of force. Analysts who had long studied the patterns of friendly fleets immediately recognized the danger. The energy signatures did not align with aid or defense. They aligned with assault. Yet, for many leaders, the hope that the fleet had come to help was so strong that they interpreted the signals as a misunderstanding or a calibration error. It was a fatal miscalculation, one that would define the next hours of their civilization's history in orbital command centers. The realization began to spread more rapidly. Scientists and military officers who had previously clung to hope began to understand the implications. Their calculations, once theoretical, now painted a horrifying picture. The fleet approaching their system was not merely powerful, it was designed for extermination. Every ship contained weapons capable of devastating entire cities, fleets, and even planetary surfaces. Their shields were optimized to withstand counterattacks, and their strategy, calculated over centuries of doctrine, was unyielding. The aliens, for all their intelligence and technological advancement, were unprepared for such an opponent. The turning point, in essence, was the moment when perception shifted from hope to horror, when the realization dawned that what they had summoned as saviors were, in fact, executioners. The tension escalated as communications with the fleet went unanswered. The aliens attempted to establish contact, sending messages of peace, pleas for negotiation, and even coded requests for clarification. Every transmission was met with silence. The Deathworlders did not ignore them out of malice. They simply had no protocol for responding to such messages in a scenario that called for preemptive neutralization. The very act of sending an SOS had triggered a predetermined response. The alien messages, filled with desperation and fear, were irrelevant to the cold logic guiding the approaching fleet. As the fleet entered the inner system, that alien civilization could no longer deny the reality of their situation. Ships moved into position around strategic locations, near major cities, energy production facilities, and planetary defense stations. The scale and precision of the formation made it clear that this was not a defensive maneuver, it was an encirclement, a calculated positioning that maximized offensive potential while minimizing exposure to counterattack. Panic became widespread. Citizens flooded streets and transit hubs, seeking refuge or attempting evacuation. Military forces scrambled to intercept, but their defenses were fragmented and under pressure. Even the most advanced weapon systems were insufficient against the sheer technological superiority of the Deathworlder fleet. Within the Deathworlder command centers, officers reviewed simulations of the impending operation. Each scenario confirmed the strategy's effectiveness within hours. The alien civilization could be neutralized entirely, leaving no survivors capable of retaliation. The precision of these calculations left no room for error. The fleet's approach was not chaotic or aggressive in a random sense. It was meticulous, efficient, and unstoppable. Every vessel played a role, every maneuver was choreographed, and every weapon system was calibrated to execute a single objective: total control through annihilation. This relentless efficiency was what defined the turning point. The aliens' perception of hope was collapsing against the unstoppable reality of an advanced, merciless force. In the alien cities, the emotional impact of this turning point was devastating. Families tried to contact one another across increasingly overloaded networks. Emergency shelters became crowded with panicked citizens. Leaders issued directives that could not be followed in time, as the scale and speed of the fleet's approach rendered conventional defense strategies obsolete. Even those who had previously doubted the fleet's intentions now had to confront the terrifying truth. Their hope was no longer a guiding force. It had become a trap, blinding them to the reality of their impending doom. The first orbital skirmishes, though limited in scale, confirmed what the analysts had feared. Reconnaissance vessels sent to intercept or observe the fleet were destroyed almost instantly, their energy signatures obliterated by weapons far beyond anything the aliens had previously encountered. Communication arrays were targeted, disabling coordinated response efforts. These early encounters demonstrated the unmatched tactical superiority of the Death. It was no longer a theoretical danger, it was an imminent, unstoppable force advancing systematically toward every major target in the system. The alien military, though valiant in its efforts, faced impossible odds. Attempts to organize fleets and planetary defense units were met with overwhelming firepower. Defensive energy grids, designed to repel lesser threats, were bypassed or destroyed. The aliens' sense of control, once carefully cultivated, dissolved in the face of the fleet's relentless efficiency. Every countermeasure, every tactical maneuver, was anticipated and neutralized. The turning point, therefore, was not only the recognition of threat but also the undeniable demonstration of the Deathworlder's superiority. Amid this chaos, the alien leaders grappled with impossible decisions. Should they attempt evacuation, knowing that escape routes were likely compromised? Should they negotiate further, risking the fleet's patience and attention? Or should they brace for the worst, preparing civilians for destruction? These decisions were compounded by the psychological impact of the turning point. The fleet, once imagined as saviors, was now understood as executioners. Every hope was shattered, replaced by fear, disbelief, and despair. The civilization's collective psyche shifted from anticipation of salvation to the grim realization that survival was uncertain at best. Meanwhile, the Deathworlders continued their advance with calculated calm. The turning point marked a change not in their approach, but in the aliens' perception of reality. While the aliens experienced fear, confusion, and desperation, the Deathworlders proceeded with unwavering purpose. Their doctrine dictated that hesitation could not exist, and that the elimination of potential threats must be conducted efficiently and completely. From their perspective, the turning point had already occurred the moment the SOS was detected, and all subsequent actions were merely the execution of a preordained plan. The alien population, meanwhile, tried to adapt to the rapidly evolving situation. Civilian shelters were reinforced, evacuation pods were readied, and communications were sent to distant outposts and colonies in the hope of coordinating assistance. Yet every measure taken seemed inadequate against the scale and precision of the approaching fleet. Panic spread like wildfire, undermining command structures and sowing chaos across cities and installations. The turning point had created a psychological as well as tactical shift. The aliens now understood, viscerally and irrevocably, that their fate was largely out of their hands. As the fleet drew closer, the inevitability of confrontation became clear. The alien civilization faced the full weight of the turning point, a moment when expectation and reality collided with devastating consequences. Every calculation, every hope, every defensive strategy had been appended. What had begun as a hopeful SOS, a cry for aid, had led to the recognition that their world was about to be engulfed by a force beyond comprehension. The turning point was complete. The aliens had glimpsed the true nature of the Deathworlders, and in doing so, their destiny was sealed. The moment the Deathworlder fleet entered the alien system, the alien civilization realized fully that hope had been replaced by a nightmare. This was no longer a situation of anticipation or caution. This was war, immediate, overwhelming, and unstoppable. Every sensor, every observation post, and every communication channel confirmed what they had long feared. The approaching fleet was not here to negotiate, not here to assist, but to destroy. The skies over the alien planets darkened as massive warships blocked out the distant light of stars, casting ominous shadows over cities, spaceports, and orbital defenses. Panic spread quickly among the population. The scale of the threat was so immense that even the most disciplined leaders struggled to maintain order. Emergency broadcasts urged calm, but the reality was that the society was on the brink of chaos. From the orbital command centers to the ground-based defense installations, the aliens attempted to organize resistance. Military fleets scrambled from docking stations, energy shields were powered to full capacity, and orbital weapon platforms engaged tracking systems to target the incoming warships. For a brief moment, a glimmer of hope appeared. The alien commanders believed that their strategy based on rapid deployment, combined firepower, and coordinated defense might be enough to slow the Deathworlder advance. However, the very first engagement shattered that hope. The Deathworlders had anticipated every possible countermeasure. Their scouts had already mapped the alien defenses, noting weak points in shield coverage, defensive grid gaps, and even the communication patterns of military fleets. Within moments of the first encounter, alien vessels were being destroyed with pinpoint accuracy. Entire squadrons vanished in seconds, their hulls torn apart by weapons far beyond the technological capability of the aliens. Defensive platforms, even when heavily armed, were rendered useless against the overwhelming firepower of the approaching fleet. Panic escalated as reports came in. Key cities were under fire, energy hubs were targeted, and communication networks began to collapse. The aliens had underestimated the Deathworlder's efficiency and ruthlessness. Every defensive maneuver they attempted was met with swift counteraction. Ships attempting to flank the fleet were intercepted before they could even reach optimal positions. Orbital cannons, calibrated to take out standard vessels, were neutralized in seconds. The strategic defensive grids that had been designed to withstand conventional attacks failed catastrophically against weapons that were experimental, precise, and devastatingly powerful. The aliens began to understand, too late, that the fleet operating against them was a well-oiled machine, with every vessel, every weapon, and every crew member functioning in perfect harmony toward a singular purpose: total destruction on the ground. Citizens watched in horror as their cities came under direct assault. Energy shields flickered under intense bombardment, sending waves of panic across streets and residential districts. Buildings crumbled, transportation networks collapsed, and mass evacuations became chaotic. Families were separated, emergency services overwhelmed, and communication lines jammed with frantic messages of fear and confusion. What had once been a thriving, orderly society was now devolving into disorder, with each passing minute bringing greater devastation. The turning point had become a full-scale catastrophe, the consequences of which no one could escape. In orbital command centers, alien military officers struggled to adapt. Conventional tactics that had been effective against less advanced foes were useless. Every attempt to intercept, flank, or engage the fleet resulted in catastrophic failure. Even the most advanced defensive strategists coordinated attacks. Evasive maneuvers, energy shield synchronization were anticipated and countered by the Deathworlders. Reports came in from reconnaissance satellites showing that the fleet's weapons were designed to neutralize not just the aliens' offensive capabilities, but also their ability to respond or flee. It was not merely a battle. It was a systematic dismantling of every means of resistance. The aliens tried to adapt their strategies in real time, but the Deathworlders were always a step ahead. Their tactical command system allowed them to analyze enemy behavior almost instantaneously, predicting movements, countering attacks, and striking with precise timing. For the alien forces, this was like trying to fight a storm with a handful of water. Every action they took was met with a calculated response designed to neutralize their advantage and exploit their weaknesses. Panic among the military ranks increased as entire formations were wiped out before they could regroup. Leadership struggled to maintain order, and the chain of command began to fracture under the relentless pressure of annihilation. Meanwhile, the Deathworlders advanced steadily. Each wave of assault was carefully coordinated to maximize impact while minimizing exposure to counterattacks. Orbital bombardments targeted key infrastructure, energy grids, communication hubs, transport nodes, and military installations. Precision strikes from their ships disabled planetary shields and tactical defenses. The alien forces, though valiant in their resistance, were fighting a battle they had no chance of winning. For every attack they launched, the Deathworlders had already predicted it and neutralized it with devastating efficiency. This major conflict was not just a war of firepower, it was a demonstration of strategy, discipline, and cold calculation. Asterisk in the cities. Civilians faced unimaginable terror. Smoke and fire rose from devastated urban centers. Emergency sirens blared and chaos engulfed every major settlement. People tried to flee, seeking refuge in shelters or attempting to escape via evacuation pods. Yet the Deathworlders' strategy was designed to leave no escape routes unchecked. Reconnaissance drones and long-range weaponry targeted fleeing populations, ensuring that even attempts at survival were fraught with danger. Panic, despair, and confusion became universal emotions as the reality of the fleet's power was made painfully clear. This was no longer a matter of defense, it was a struggle to survive against an opponent that operated on an entirely different scale of capability and ruthlessness. The alien military made desperate last attempts to organize counteroffensive. Fleet commanders launched coordinated strikes against the Deathworlder vessels, targeting perceived weak points in the formation. Planetary defense cannons fired volleys of energy in an effort to halt the fleet's advance. Strategic retreats were attempted, with forces regrouping to secondary defensive positions. However, every measure was anticipated, every tactic counted. Ships attempting to flee were intercepted, defensive structures were destroyed, and communication networks collapsed under electronic attacks. The major conflict had reached a point where survival was no longer guaranteed, and resistance was being methodically crushed. Even as the destruction unfolded, there were small acts of bravery among the aliens. Pilots flew their ships against overwhelming odds, ground forces defended critical locations, and leaders remained at command centers trying to coordinate defenses. These acts, though valiant, were largely symbolic against the sheer power of the Deathworlder fleet. Each courageous action was met with overwhelming retaliation. demonstrating not only the technological superiority of the invaders, but also their unwavering discipline. This major conflict was a test not only of skill and technology, but also of courage and resolve, and the aliens were being pushed to their absolute limits. As the Deathworlders advanced, they employed a combination of precision strikes, orbital bombardments, and electronic warfare. Planetary shields were taken down with carefully calculated attacks, fleets were annihilated before they could reach striking range, and communication networks were rendered useless. The aliens' attempts at resistance were futile, their strategies anticipated and neutralized with ease. The conflict escalated into a systematic, unrelenting campaign, leaving little room for hope or survival. The major conflict had become a battle of survival, and the aliens were quickly realizing that the odds were overwhelmingly against them at the leadership level. Alien commanders faced impossible choices. Should they attempt to negotiate, knowing that communication had failed? Should they order mass evacuation, knowing that escape routes were compromised? Should they fight to the last, accepting inevitable destruction? These decisions were complicated by the speed and efficiency of the Deathworlder fleet, which left little time for deliberation. The major conflict had become not just a battle of technology and firepower, but a race against time. As the aliens struggled to respond to a foe that anticipated every move, the psychological impact of the major conflict was devastating. Civilians, military personnel, and leaders all experienced fear, despair, and confusion. Families were torn apart, cities were destroyed, and critical infrastructure collapsed. Even those trained for emergencies were overwhelmed by the scale and intensity of the assault. The turning point had already shifted the aliens' mindset from hope to horror, and the major conflict solidified the reality. Survival was uncertain, resistance was almost impossible, and the Deathworlders were an unstoppable force amid the chaos. The Deathworlders continued their advance with calm precision. Each vessel performed its role flawlessly, each weapon fired with calculated efficiency, and each crew member executed commands with unwavering discipline. The major conflict, from their perspective, was simply the execution of a preordained plan. There was no hesitation, no moral dilemma, and no mercy. The SOS had triggered a response, and the fleet was fulfilling its objective. The total neutralization of a potential threat, every destruction, every obliterated city, and every intercepted vessel was part of a strategy perfected over centuries of experience and doctrine. By the end of the first wave of conflict, the alien civilization was in ruins. Major cities were reduced to rubble, fleets were annihilated, and communication networks lay in fragments. Survivors fled wherever they could, seeking refuge in underground bunkers, remote colonies, or hidden outposts. Yet, even as they sought safety, they knew that the Deathworlders were relentless. The major conflict was far from over, and the aliens understood that every attempt to resist would be met with overwhelming retaliation. The destruction had begun, and there was no turning back. The scale of the devastation was staggering. Entire continents were scorched, orbital stations obliterated, and civilian populations decimated. The aliens' attempts at counteroffensive had failed entirely, and their hope of survival had diminished. The major conflict was a demonstration of overwhelming power, tactical brilliance, and cold ruthlessness. The Deathworlders were executing their mission with perfection, leaving nothing to chance and no survivors capable of retaliation. It was not just a battle. It was a demonstration of inevitability, a stark reminder of the consequences of summoning forces beyond understanding. Even as some survivors clung to life, the reality of the major conflict was undeniable. The alien civilization had underestimated the scale and efficiency of the Deathworlder fleet. Every defensive measure, every counterattack, every tactical maneuver had been anticipated and neutralized. The aliens' hope for rescue had turned into a struggle for survival, and the scale of the destruction was a lesson in the consequences of underestimating a force that operated on a level far beyond their comprehension. The aftermath of the major conflict was devastating. Though the Deathworlders themselves moved with the same calm precision they had shown throughout the assault, the alien civilization, once thriving with bustling cities, advanced fleets, and flourishing populations, was now a shadow of its former self. From orbit, the destruction was absolute. Cities lay in ruins, their once proud structures reduced to smoldering remnants. Energy grids and communication networks were completely disabled, leaving no means of coordinated response. Planetary landscapes bore the marks of indiscriminate bombardment, scorched continents, craters large enough to be seen from orbit, and the skeletal remains of once vibrant metropolises. The scale of the devastation was staggering, almost unimaginable, and yet, for the Deathworlders, this was merely the completion of their mission, executed with flawless efficiency. For the aliens who survived, the moment was filled with horror and disbelief. Those few who had managed to take shelter in remote bunkers or underground complexes now emerged cautiously, surveying the devastation around them. The cities they had grown up in, the technological marvels they had built, and the society they had taken pride in were all gone. The surviving population was scattered, traumatized, and uncertain whether they could ever rebuild. Even the natural environment had been altered. Regions that had once been fertile and vibrant were now scorched wastelands. The resolution of the conflict, in the eyes of the aliens, that was not a victory or a defeat in the traditional sense. It was the realization that their civilization had been irrevocably changed. Their survival left to a fragile few. In the orbit above the planets, the Deathworlder fleet moved methodically. Each ship had completed its assigned targets, destroying the alien fleets, disabling defensive installations, and ensuring that no effective resistance remained. Unlike other species that might linger to assess or negotiate, the Deathworlders operated according to a strict doctrine. Once the mission was complete, they withdrew. Their exit was as precise as their entry. There was no celebration, no ritual, no acknowledgement of their actions other than the cold satisfaction of efficiency. For the Deathworlders, the resolution of this operation was simply the final step in a well-executed plan. Their senses confirmed the absence of active defense, and with this knowledge, the fleet began its departure from the alien system. Among the surviving aliens, confusion and despair dominated the atmosphere. Small groups of civilians gathered, seeking to comprehend the enormity of what had occurred. Leaders and military officers who had survived attempted to regroup, to find pockets of organization within the shattered society. Communications, though severely limited, began to connect these scattered survivors, allowing them to share information about safe locations, assess casualties, and begin rudimentary planning for recovery. Yet, the psychological toll of the event was immense. The fleet's intervention had not brought salvation but annihilation, and the survivors were left with a mixture of grief, disbelief, and fear. The resolution, therefore, was not merely the cessation of combat but the full realization of the consequences. The alien civilization had been nearly erased, and the survivors' lives would never be the same. In the aftermath, the alien military attempted to analyze what had gone wrong. Tactical reports, sensor logs, and surviving reconnaissance data were compiled to understand the fleet's strategy and the reasons for their total dominance. Every calculation, every estimate, every defensive measure had been anticipated and counted. The surviving officers came to a grim understanding. They had misjudged the capabilities, intent, and ruthlessness of the Deathworld. Every action the aliens had taken to resist, no matter how brave or well-intentioned, had been neutralized. The resolution of the conflict, then, was not simply the end of hostilities. It was the stark acknowledgement of a force beyond comprehension, a lesson in humility and survival against an opponent whose doctrine left no room for mercy or error. For the civilian population, the resolution brought different challenges. Basic necessities, food, water, and shelter were now scarce. Infrastructure had been destroyed, and systems for distribution and governance had collapsed. Families, torn apart by the chaos, sought reunification amidst the rubble. Communities that had once been well-organized and thriving were now forced to improvise, relying on whatever resources remained to maintain survival. There was no immediate threat from the Deathworlders anymore, but the challenge of survival in the devastated landscape became the primary concern. The resolution, from the perspective of the survivors, was both an end and a beginning. The battle was over, but the struggle to live and rebuild had only just begun. The psychological impact of the fleet's actions was profound. Survivors grappled with the enormity of what had happened and the realization that the SOS they had set a desperate call for help had instead brought total destruction. Feelings of guilt, fear, and confusion mingled with grief. Many wondered how an appeal for aid could result in annihilation, struggling to reconcile their intentions with the outcome. The resolution, therefore, was not simply external but deeply internal. Survivors had to confront the harsh reality that hope, when misunderstood, could lead to catastrophe. This understanding would shape their thoughts, decisions, and culture for generations to come. Across the alien planets, the physical landscape told a story of complete devastation. Craters from bombardments scarred continents, while coastal cities were reduced to rubble. Forests, oceans, and mountain ranges bore the marks of intense energy strikes and orbital weaponry. Even natural resources had been affected. Water supplies were contaminated, arable land destroyed, and energy networks disabled. The aliens who survived had to navigate a transformed world where every step carried potential danger. The resolution of the conflict had reshaped not only their civilization but also the environment they depended on. The challenge of survival now extended to every aspect of life, from securing clean water to finding shelter in landscapes that were no longer safe or hospitable as the Deathworlders withdrew from the system. Their mission was complete, leaving behind silence and desolation. From their perspective, the resolution was objective, unemotional, and final. The alien civilization had been neutralized as a potential threat, the SOS addressed in a manner consistent with Deathworlder doctrine, and the fleet could now proceed to its next assignment without delay. There was no triumph in their actions, no sense of conquest beyond the execution of duty. The resolution was complete, and the Deathworlders moved on, leaving the survivors to grapple with the full implications of what had transpired for the alien survivors. Rebuilding seemed an almost impossible task. Leadership structures had been decimated, communication networks destroyed, and technological infrastructure obliterated. Some survivors attempted to locate others, forming small groups to share resources and protect one another. Scattered settlements began to emerge, often in remote or hidden locations, as people sought to avoid further harm. Despite the overwhelming devastation, however, there was a flicker of resilience. The survivors, though traumatized, recognized that adaptation and cooperation would be essential for continued existence. In this way, the resolution of the conflict became not only the end of the immediate battle, but also the starting point for the arduous process of survival and potential reconstruction. The alien culture itself underwent a profound transformation as a result of the resolution. Traditions, social structures, and collective beliefs had been challenged by the magnitude of destruction. The stories of the Deathworlders, their efficiency, and the futility of resistance spread among survivors, shaping the way they thought about the universe and the risks of interstellar communication. Lessons learned from this catastrophic event would influence education, governance, and philosophy for generations. The resolution, therefore, had a dual character. Externally, it marked the cessation of conflict. Internally, it reshaped the alien civilization's perception of the universe and their place within it. The alien leaders who survived faced an almost insurmountable task. They had to make critical decisions about governance, resource allocation, and the protection of the remaining population. With cities destroyed and infrastructure dismantled, leadership became a matter of coordination, strategy, and moral responsibility. The resolution of the conflict demanded more than recognition of what had occurred. It demanded action to ensure that survival, no matter how tenuous, could continue. Leaders worked tirelessly to organize safe zones, distribute limited supplies, and maintain order among traumatized and displaced populations. Every decision was weighed against the backdrop of devastation, and the consequences of mistakes were immediate and severe in the psychological realm. The resolution had a lasting effect on individual survivors. Many experienced trauma, grief, and survivor's guilt. The knowledge that their SOS had unintentionally triggered their near extinction left deep emotional scars. Communities that had once been unified faced challenges of trust, cohesion, and cooperation as they attempted to navigate the aftermath. In response, support structures, though informal, began to emerge. Elders, leaders, and survivors who had retained skills or knowledge from before the conflict became pillars of guidance, helping others cope with the reality of their altered existence. The resolution, therefore, encompassed both the external outcome of destruction and the internal process of emotional and societal adaptation. As weeks and months passed, the alien civilization slowly began to understand the permanence of the change brought by the Deathworlders. What had been a thriving society capable of interstellar communication and advanced technology was now fragmented and scattered. Even as some survivors attempted to rebuild settlements, the knowledge that the fleet had passed through their system served as a constant reminder of their vulnerability. The resolution had not restored balance or peace. It had imposed a harsh reality that required adaptation, humility, and vigilance. The survivors' perspective of the universe, once filled with hope and opportunity, was now tempered by fear, respect, and caution. In essence, the resolution of the conflict marked a profound turning point for the alien civilization. The Deathworlders had achieved their objective with precision, leaving no meaningful opposition behind. For the aliens, survival had become a central concern, overshadowing previous ambitions, technologies, and societal structures. The resolution was not celebratory, not redemptive, and not forgiving. It was absolute, final, and transformative. The alien civilization was forever changed, its history rewritten, and its future uncertain. The survivors, though resilient, were left to navigate a universe that had revealed itself to be far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Even as life slowly continued among the scattered survivors, the shadow of the Deathworlder fleet lingered. Tales of the devastation were shared cautiously, forming the foundation of a new collective memory. The resolution of the immediate conflict had been clear. The fleet had left. The destruction was complete, but its consequences would echo for generations. The survivors adapted to their new reality, rebuilt where they could, and began to plan cautiously for a future in which the universe's dangers were fully understood. The resolution was, in every sense, the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, a harsh lesson in the consequences of summoning forces far beyond comprehension. The silence that followed the withdrawal of the Deathworlder fleet was almost deafening. Across the alien system, the absence of movement, sound, and communication was stark and overwhelming. Cities that had once teemed with life were now empty landscapes of scorched ruins and crumbling structures. Energy grids, once the lifeblood of civilization, lay in fragments, their failures leaving entire regions without light, heat, or communication. Satellites and orbital stations were destroyed, leaving holes in the sky where observation platforms once floated. The atmosphere was thick with dust and ash, carrying the residue of fires that had consumed entire urban centers. For the surviving aliens, the aftermath was not just physical but profoundly emotional, a moment of reckoning where the enormity of loss became tangible, almost unbearable. Those who survived the initial onslaught emerged cautiously from their shelters, scanning the horizon for signs of continued threat. The first step into the world beyond the bunkers was met with shock and disbelief. Familiar landscapes had been transformed into alien terrain. Streets that had been vibrant now resembled canyons of rubble. Towering structures reduced to skeletal frameworks, and neighborhoods turned into a labyrinth of destruction. Even the natural environment bore scars from the conflict. Forests had been charred, rivers and lakes contaminated with debris, and mountains cratered from orbital bombardment. The survivors had stepped into a world they no longer recognized, and every step they took reminded them of the scale of the catastrophe. Communication among survivors was difficult. Devices that had once allowed instant contact across continents were either destroyed or none. Attempts to transmit signals met with silence. Even the most resilient networks had been disabled by the precision strikes of the Deathworlder fleet. As a result, survivors relied on manual means, messengers, physical travel, and word of mouth to locate others. Groups began to form, connecting scattered individuals into small communities. These gatherings, though fragile and vulnerable, that became the foundation for rebuilding society, representing the first glimmers of hope in a world where hope had been nearly extinguished. Leadership among the survivors became crucial. Those who had previously held positions of authority, whether in government, military, or scientific communities, now faced unprecedented challenges. Resources were scarce, and decisions carried life or death consequences. Leaders had to coordinate food distribution, water access, shelter, and protection against the lingering dangers in the environment. Their task was made even more difficult by the psychological toll on the population. Many survivors were traumatized, struggling to comprehend the annihilation of entire cities and fleets. Their minds wrestled with the implications of the SOS they had sent, a call meant for help that had instead led to devastation. Leadership in this period of aftermath required not only strategy and organization but also emotional resilience and empathy among the population. Grief and guilt became pervasive. Survivors mourned the loss of family, friends, and entire communities. Those who had sent the SOS questioned their decision, wondering how an act intended to secure aid had instead triggered the arrival of total destruction. These questions were not easily answered. The Deathworlders' motives, cold and unyielding, offered no explanation. Their doctrine of preemptive neutralization was absolute, leaving survivors to interpret events through their own perspectives, often in confusion and fear. The aftermath was, therefore, not only a physical and societal challenge but a psychological one. As the survivors confronted the magnitude of loss and the inexplicable nature of what had occurred in the first weeks following the fleet's departure, survival was the primary concern. Access to food and clean water became critical. Agricultural systems had been destroyed or contaminated, requiring improvisation for sustenance. Storage facilities, even when intact, had limited supplies, forcing communities to ration and carefully manage their resources. The destruction of power grids further complicated survival efforts. Without energy, water purification systems, heating, lighting, and other critical services were unavailable. People relied on scavenging, local natural resources, and ingenuity to maintain life. The aftermath demanded adaptability, cooperation, and resilience on a scale previously unimagined. Efforts to rebuild communication networks began cautiously. Survivors scavenged old equipment, attempting to piece together functional relays and transmitters. Small groups worked tirelessly to restore basic connectivity, seeking to coordinate efforts and share vital information. Even partially restored networks allowed for limited contact between communities, enabling the exchange of intelligence on safe areas, supplies, and potential hazards. These networks became lifelines critical for maintaining organization, preventing panic, and supporting the slow process of societal reconstruction. The environmental damage posed long-term challenges. Fires had destroyed forests and grasslands, reducing available food sources and altering ecosystems. Rivers and lakes were contaminated with debris and pollutants from destroyed infrastructure. Soil quality was diminished, affecting agriculture and natural vegetation. In addition to physical hazards, the psychological impact of these changes weighed heavily on survivors. A once familiar world had become alien and dangerous, compounding the trauma of loss and destruction. Adapting to these changes required resourcefulness, knowledge of the local terrain, and careful planning to avoid further catastrophe. The societal impact of the Deathworlder attack extended beyond immediate survival. Culture, traditions, and collective memory were profoundly affected. Libraries, archives, and records had been destroyed, erasing centuries of knowledge and heritage. Education systems were disrupted, leaving young survivors without guidance or mentorship. Scientific research facilities had been obliterated, limiting technological advancement and access to information. The aftermath was not merely physical but intellectual and cultural. As survivors grappled with the loss of history, knowledge, and identity, rebuilding society would require not only physical reconstruction but also the preservation and recovery of culture, memory, and learning. In the midst of devastation, acts of courage and humanity emerged. Small groups organized protective patrols, defended vulnerable areas, and shared scarce resources. Communities that could communicate over partially restored networks, coordinated supply routes and safe zones. These efforts, though limited in scope, became vital lifelines, offering the survivors both practical support and emotional reassurance. The aftermath, while overwhelmingly destructive, also revealed the resilience, ingenuity, and compassion of those who endured. Reflection became a central part of the survivors' experience. They considered the decisions that had led to the SOS, the assumptions that had shaped their response, and the events that had culminated in the fleet's destruction. Scholars, leaders, and ordinary citizens debated endlessly, attempting to understand why a plea for help had resulted in annihilation. Over time, these reflections evolved into lessons. The universe was not inherently just powerful forces could act according to rules beyond human comprehension, and survival required caution, foresight, and humility. These lessons would shape the collective consciousness of the survivors for generations. The survivors also faced moral and ethical questions. Should they attempt to rebuild as before, or should they adapt to a new paradigm of caution and isolation? How should they honor the memory of those lost? How should they prepare for potential future threats? These questions, difficult under any circumstances, were magnified by the scale of destruction and trauma. Reflection on the past, the choices made, and the consequences of the SOS became essential for guiding decisions in the post-conflict world. These reflections influenced governance, community planning, and even interpersonal relationships, embedding lessons learned into the fabric of society. Even as life slowly resumed, the psychological scars of the experience remained. Survivors experienced fear, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress, knowing that the Deathworlders had eliminated potential threats with ruthless efficiency. Nightmares, grief, and uncertainty were widespread. Communities relied on storytelling, rituals, and shared memory to process the trauma and maintain social cohesion. In this way, reflection was not only intellectual but also emotional, allowing survivors to navigate the aftermath while preserving the bonds necessary for survival. Over time, survivors began to adapt to the new reality. Makeshift settlements were established in safe areas, often hidden or remote, to avoid potential threats. Agriculture resumed on a smaller scale, utilizing uncontaminated land. Knowledge and skills were shared among community members to ensure survival. The society that emerged from the aftermath was different from the one that had existed before, shaped by trauma, necessity, and the lessons of the past. Reflection, observation, and careful planning became central to their way of life, and the memory of the Deathworlders' attack served as a constant reminder of the universe's dangers. Some survivors sought to document their experiences, recording what had happened in hopes of preventing similar disasters in the future. Diaries, reports, and oral histories preserved the knowledge of the events, the strategies attempted, and the human experiences of loss and survival. These records became cultural touchstones, guiding the development of new societal norms and ensuring that the lessons of the aftermath were not forgotten. Reflection, therefore, was intertwined with preservation, allowing survivors to build a foundation for a more cautious and informed civilization. Communities also began to rebuild a sense of identity and cohesion. Shared suffering created bonds among survivors, and collective memory of the event shaped the values, priorities, and culture of the post-conflict society. Cooperation, resourcefulness, and vigilance became central virtues, emphasized in education, governance, and community life. Reflection on the past guided the development of a culture designed to endure, even in a universe where powerful and unpredictable forces existed beyond their control. The experience of the aftermath also led to innovations in survival strategies. Survivors developed new methods of resource management, shelter construction, and defensive planning. They adapted to environmental changes caused by the fleet's destruction, finding ways to cultivate food, purify water, and establish sustainable communities. Reflection on the failures of the past, combined with the practical realities of the present, drove creativity and resilience. The society that emerged, though scarred, demonstrated remarkable ingenuity and adaptability. In addition, the survivors' understanding of interstellar communication and contact evolved. The SOS, once a symbol of hope, became a cautionary tale. Future attempts to reach beyond their system were tempered with careful consideration of potential risks. Based on the lessons learned from the Deathworlders' actions, reflection ensured that mistakes would not be repeated, and that the survivors could approach future challenges with greater wisdom, caution, and strategic awareness. Over the years, the alien civilization slowly rebuilt, incorporating the lessons of the aftermath into every aspect of life. Communities grew stronger, not by returning to pre-conflict norms, but by adapting to a universe they now understood to be dangerous and unpredictable. Reflection became a core cultural practice, informing decisions, strategies, and societal values. Survivors remembered the past, honored those lost, and prepared for a future in which survival required intelligence, caution, and resilience. The resolution of the Deathworlder intervention marked not only the end of immediate conflict but the beginning of a long period of recovery, reflection, and transformation. The alien civilization was forever changed, its survivors carrying the memory of destruction as a guide for rebuilding society. The aftermath was not simply the absence of combat, it was a profound and lasting process of adaptation, learning, and reflection that would shape the course of history for generations to come. In the end, the surviving aliens emerged as a civilization transformed. They had witnessed the consequences of misjudgment, of hope placed in the wrong hands, and of underestimating forces beyond their comprehension. Yet, despite the trauma, devastation, and loss, they endured. The aftermath and reflection became their guide, shaping a cautious, intelligent, and resilient society determined to survive in a universe that had demonstrated both its beauty and its brutality.